Hello world, welcome to the 90-second video on my channel where I'm building my own digital assistant named Shane, like Jarvis from the Iron Man movies and comics. In today's video, we're going to be expanding on our small business automation playlist, and we'll be using Shane, our digital assistant, to help answer routine business management finance questions. And so specifically, we'll be discussing like tax deductions for small businesses. And so I created something similar. It was like a Google search bar where I could type in string queries like you would Google, and it would answer all my finance work questions, just the routine ones that you used to have to open several files up. So I just made a string-based version of that, and that's kind of what we're doing here. So let's see how it works. So let's run this. So, what information about our small business would you like to know? So first, what deductions are we tracking? All right, so now there's a list, right? It says office supplies, office furniture, advertising, travel expenses, legal and professional services. Now that is not an all-inclusive list. So if for some reason I have tax professionals out there, I know there are a ton more. But that is just for this demonstration. Okay, and now let's say, let's run this again. And how much have we, or how much deductions do we have this year? Okay, so far in my little database, we have $115 in deductions this year. All right, so what's this pulling? This is using Python's pyodbc library to access a access database that I have where we have some data about our small business. All right, so that's the code. So now let's go check out our access database and set up your own small business expense tracker. Okay, we're back. We're in the same Access database that we were in our previous video. And so now we're going to create a table and we're just going to call it deduction. So let's save this as deduction. All right, and now let's make this a short text and let's call these deductions. Deductions. Okay, so the first one, let's do office supplies, and then we'll do office furniture, and then advertising, travel expenses, and legal and professional services. Okay, so in our code that we'll go over after this, this is the list that you saw that it printed up. So our Python code was able to go to this table and look it up. Okay, now we're going to leave this ID column in there. So what you're supposed to do before setting up any Access database or SQL database or any kind of database, even just a Excel table, you should think beforehand what kind of data you want in there. And so usually you create primary keys or relationships, and you may or may not use IDs like customer ID to manage everything. So we're just going to leave the ID in there, but just know if you're new to Access Database that you really should think about what are the relationships between all your data before establishing tables and forms and queries. Okay, so like I said, we're going to leave this ID column in there, and that's all we're going to do. So let's exit out of there, and now let's create a new table, and we're going to call this expenses. And this is where whoever's managing my business, if it's a person, will enter in information. So let's make this first one a date time. Okay, so let's just do general date here, and let's call this the date. Okay, and now we're gonna call this, let's put it in, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna go lookup and relationship. So let's do that. And let's use the wizard. So I want the lookup field to get the values from another table. That's the default, so click next. And then which table or query would you like to look? So let's go into deduction next. Okay, we just want the deduction fields. But like I said, as you build bigger and bigger databases, think about the one field that's going to be similar to all of them. So, but we just want deductions. We don't need it ascending, but if you want it alphabetically or numerically, you could do that. Okay, are those all the ones you want there? Yep, we're going to hide the key column. Okay, next. And what are we going to call this? Let's call it deduction list. And let's finish. Okay, so now we have a list that we just created. And as we update this, so let's put, what's another one? Mileage. No, that's kind of under travel expenses, even though it's not. So let's put in, what else do we need? Office supplies, office furniture, advertising, travel expenses, legal. Let's do startup costs. Okay, let's save that. Okay, let's go back to expenses. Okay, let's exit out of expenses and go back in it. Okay, now we have startup costs. Great. And then let's put this one and let's make it currency. I like this format, and let's just call this amount. Okay, great. So let's save that. And so I would make a form for this, but let's say today's date is the 28th, and we're going to do office supplies for $5. And then also today, we spent $10 on a Facebook ad or something, so that's $10. And then let's do legal and professional services at $15. Or I'm sorry, $100. Yeah, right. Legal and professional services cost so much money. So let's save that. So right now you can do the sum in your head. That's 115, and you saw that earlier in the Python code that we ran. So, but when you're going to have hundreds of thousands and hopefully millions of, or I'm sorry, hopefully you don't have that many expenses, but as you have hundreds of expenses and multiple years, you won't be able to quickly do it, and that's why automating it will be better. Okay, so let's exit out of this. So now we have our Access database. Now let's check out the code. So let's clear that. All right, so this is in the previous video, so make sure you watch that. We imported this library called pyodbc. We told it that it's going to be, we're going to need the access driver, and this is the file path of the database we created. Then you need to tell it what kind of data source you have and what kind of access driver you're going to have. And we're using MS Access Database. Now, please make sure you watch my previous videos. There'll be a link to the playlist in here because we're just going straight on to the new stuff. Then we created a connection and we passed it the driver and file path. And then we started a cursor. All right. And so what we did was we asked ourselves a question, right? This is me mimicking what myself, the boss, would be asking you daily. So we do an input of what information about our small business would you like to know? And then you saw me type in what deductions are we tracking? So what you're going to do is you're going to establish a query equals cursor, which we've already done up here. This is where we called this, dot execute. And then in a string, you put select all from deduction. Then we're going to create a list, then a cursor dot fetch all, right? Because we know there's multiple things, and we're going to fetch all. And then for each deduction in that list, we're going to print the deduction. Now, pyodbc will find the primary key. And so what we want is just all we want is the list of the deduction. So that's actually the second part of, the second item in each list, in each row. So we want, in programming, you start with 0, then 1. So the first index is actually the second list. And then we're going to print up each one. So anything else, now once I put in multiple questions, this will change to an elif statement that says, but what's the total of our expenses so far? So this is what we're going to do, and what we're really doing is just using SQL syntax. So we're going to execute a query, select the sum of the column called amount from expenses. Then you're going to put that in a data variable, and we're just going to fetch 1, because this sum is going to sum up all of them, and just put it in one index. And then it's going to show up right here, a data 0, and what that is it's a list. So we can check that out, what it looks like right now. So let's just print this data. Okay. So we are going to run this again, and let's just put else. So it's a list, right? It's a decimal, 115 to 4 places, comma, and then there's nothing in here. There's no field here. Okay, so what we want though is we just want the amount. So if we just printed data and then the 0 index, we would get this, 115 with 2 decimal places. Okay, so, but what we want to do is make it a float. So float. All right. And since I'm going to be passing it into a string, when we ask it a question, we need to make it a string. And that's what this complicated thing is here. So this right here, data, is a Python decimal object. We just want the first item in it. Then we make it a float, so we can make it a string. Then you can concatenate it into a string like this. So you have amount in deductions this year. So let's do that. Else, you have $115 in deductions this year. And that's what we put that you just saw in the Access database. And then what deductions are we tracking? And there's the list that you saw in the beginning with the additional startup costs. All right, so if you've ran an office before or a large portfolio, you know that the majority of your time is just answering your boss's questions. So why not automate that? So in a small business, I might only have one employee, and instead of asking my employee that all day long, I can just ask my digital assistant, Shane. And that's the whole goal of this project. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little bit of Access tutorial, it's a little bit of SQL tutorial, and some Python tutorial. So please consider subscribing if you want to continue watching me build this project, and or watching me build my digital assistant named Shane. Thanks for watching. Goodbye, world.